The EU did announce it was going to have retaliatory tariffs at the start, and it's gone from a situation in which it said it was going to have retaliatory tariffs and get into a trade war with the US to agreeing to have no tariffs on stuff that comes into the EU, but 15% tariffs on stuff that goes into the US. I mean, I think that's political humiliation, really.
To add a bit of extra salt in the wound, the fact the United Kingdom got 10% and the European Union got 15% will be damaging, given how important the idea that you'd be stronger in a large trade bloc. That was a key argument during the Brexit negotiations back in the day, or before the Brexit negotiations, during the referendum.
Resident doctors are demanding a pay rise, and many of them are refusing to work until they get it.
This business with RPI, I mean, what a nonsense that is. RPI was de-designated as an official inflation measure in the UK more than a decade ago.
I mean, the whole RPI metric is quite funny to me, because I doubt any single profession in the UK, with maybe the exception of YouTubers, has seen a salary increase since 2008 using RPI.
From CapEx, this is The Capitalist. I'm Mark Sidwell, and my guests today are the political analyst Francois Valentin and Andrew Lilico, an economist. The US and EU have just signed what's being called the biggest trade deal in history, following talks in Scotland. But despite the grand headlines, the details remain scarce. Early reaction suggests the EU has made the bigger concessions. Analysts are already predicting a 0.5% GDP hit, while many Americans, already grappling with rising costs of living, could soon face higher prices on European imports. The deal still needs approval from all 27 EU nations, and President Trump is likely to face a growing backlash if prices continue to climb. So is anyone really emerging as the winner? Francois, let's start with you. What's your reaction to this US-EU trade deal?
Two things can be true at once. It can both be a politically very embarrassing deal. On the economic front, however, I am not completely sure it will be massively damaging to the extent that some people are presenting it. It's politically damaging, of course, because on paper it looks very little concessions were given by Donald Trump, who simply slapped tariffs and waited for the Europeans to come back, groveling, asking for a new deal. On the economic side, however, the 15% tariff is high, but I'm not convinced the Europeans will end up paying for it. I suspect American consumers will end up paying a fair share of it. The pledges we have on investments, on weapons, on energy, some of these things are going to happen either way. Europeans need more energy, they need more weapons. There's a whole front that needs to be built around with Ukraine. And lastly, the investments are all very hazy. So in my opinion, we'll see more about the details. And as much as it's politically damaging, I'm not sure it will be all that much economically damaging.
Andrew, on that point about who's paying for it, it does get a little confusing in the way these things are talked about in the negotiations. But of course, as Francois says, in the end, this is something that's going to be costing US importers, passed on to US companies and US consumers for these higher tariffs. So in a very real sense, it's the Americans who are paying for this. Although, of course, there will be hits to EU exporters who'll find the export more expensive for them. I mean, what's your take on all of this?
Well, there's quite a lot going on with this kind of arrangement. I mean, it remains to be seen, as you say, whether the EU will pass it. It remains to be seen whether Donald Trump really has the power to do the various tariff things which he's been promising to do. The main benefits of doing a trade deal are that they allow you to have lower tariffs on and lower trade barriers on imports into your zone than you have elsewhere. So the key benefit from the EU from this deal are the zero tariff arrangements which they have with the US, which they don't need to then have for everybody else in the world, because they don't necessarily want to have them for everybody else in the world. So the EU gains to that extent. On the exporter side, I mean, exporters' effects are always less important economically than importer effects. On the exporter side, we obviously get from a situation where a few months ago, was it less than 1.5% effective tariff for US on EU goods to 15% as the default now, though how much of that might be higher for some products and how much might be lower is all up in the air at the moment. But the exact economic effects of that for the EU, even for the EU exporters, may depend crucially on what Trump does in terms of tariffs on everybody else. Because if his tariffs on other countries are at least that high or higher, then the losses to an EU exporter relative to imports into the US from somewhere else it goes through as a wash, right? So if the Americans would have bought the stuff from Brazil, and they're the competitors to the EU. They buy from Brazil and the EU, and then the EU has 15% tariffs. Suppose that Brazil also has 15% tariffs. It doesn't mean that the EU goods become any more expensive. There may be some reduction for the aggregate amount of imports that go into the US from elsewhere, but even that's not completely clear. So the whole thing's very, very messy. It's largely a matter of the Americans hurting themselves through their higher tariffs. The EU, it's not very clear to me why the EU has agreed to this politically. There's some suggestion that it's some kind of pressure to do with Ukraine and that there's some kind of quid pro quo going on, and the Americans were threatening basically that they'd cut Ukraine off if the EU didn't agree to this. It's certainly embarrassing from the EU point of view, to be in a situation where they agreed to such high tariffs after they said some quite macho things. I mean, a number of other countries didn't get into any of this. We'll impose higher tariffs and retaliatory tariffs and all of that kind of thing, like the UK, for example, when Trump initially announced them. The EU did announce it was going to have retaliatory tariffs at the start, and it's gone from a situation in which it said it was going to have retaliatory tariffs and get into a trade war with the US to agreeing to have no tariffs on stuff that comes into the EU, but 15% tariffs on stuff that goes into the US. I mean, I think that's political humiliation, really.
Yeah, I mean, Francois, on that point that Andrew raises there, do you think the EU comes out of this looking politically weakened?
To add a bit of extra salt in the wound, the fact the United Kingdom got 10% and the European Union got 15% will be damaging, given how important the idea that you'd be stronger in a large trade bloc. That was a key argument during the Brexit negotiations back in the day, or before the Brexit negotiations, during the referendum. So there's an extra kind of damage here. There's going to be a lot of, people are going to be screaming at it in different European capitals. I know the Italians and the Germans are quite favourable. In France, they're less so, considerably less so. The reality is I don't think anyone was up for a fight. I know Macron kind of mentioned the idea of setting up tariffs on 100 billion of US goods. That didn't go through. You do wonder whether a weaker Macron, as he is now, is made this possible in a sense. Wonder whether the kind of fully Jupiterian Macron of 2018 would have allowed such a humiliation to go through. But to go back on the point of the UK, there's something quite mechanistic about the whole process. I know some people were arguing that had the EU gone to DC before that, early on, they would have got better terms. I'm not sure. I think it's a very simplistic formula going on, 10% for the UK, because the UK is one of the few countries of the world to actually have a trade deficit with the United States, and 50% for the EU because we have a trade surplus. So it's quite simplistic. It's humiliating. I'm not sure much will be done immediately. I think it will go through and the EU 27 will accept it. But I think the long term, even among the kind of most pro-European electorate, you'll get a lot of people thinking, what's the point of the whole thing if we end up getting humiliated like this by a partner? So it's damaging, and it's probably going to be more damaging in the long term than in the short run.
Very strange language there was as well about this business of saying that from von der Leyen saying that it was trying to address a problem of the EU having a trade surplus with the US, which is buying into that kind of weird Trump idea that a trade surplus is a bad thing. Just a very strange idea.
Yeah, I mean, just before we move on, Andrew, it is interesting, isn't it, that Trump seems to be normalizing the idea of much higher tariffs. People are even slightly grateful that they're not much higher than this. I get the feeling that these things seem like they are permanent changes. It's hard to imagine maybe a new Democrat administration coming in post-Trump and suddenly tearing all the tariffs down again. This seems like a complete remaking of the global trade order, or a new normal for it.
certainly a new normal for the Americans. Whether other people buy into it is another story. There was a very strange tweet from the Council of Economic Advisors, Trump's one of his economic advisors, saying economists. He had this thing mocking economists, saying, 15 to 20% tariffs are optimal, but you can't do them because other countries will retaliate and you won't agree. And it was like, who are these economists that think that 15 to 20% tariffs rates are optimal? Do you know any of them? I've never met. I know. I've come across economists who think that you should have autarky and have like 200% tariffs. What economist thinks 15 to 20% tariffs are optimal? I've never come across that. And yet somehow in America, this has come to be, people feel like they can say this is a normal economic idea.
Let's move on to something a little closer to home. Resident doctors are demanding a pay rise, and many of them are refusing to work until they get it. Despite receiving a 28.9% pay boost over the last 3 years, which is the highest in the public sector, they argue their salaries have actually been slashed in real terms since 2008. Citing RPI inflation, which is a less commonly used measure, they claim they need a further 29% increase for what they call pay restoration. However, if you use CPI inflation, their pay has only dropped by 4.7%, and as Alice Denby wrote in CapEx, it seems that 2008 was chosen as a benchmark because it was the end of the public spending boom as the global financial crisis hit. A near 30% rise, though, is simply unaffordable, and the majority of public opinion is now against the strikes. Yet the government failed to find a negotiated solution, and with nurses too now rejecting their pay deal and threatening industrial action as well, is there any way to stop more strikes to come? Francois, if I can come to you, is Labour simply too close to the unions to stand firm against them and find a way out of this sort of perpetual cycle of strikes?
I'm not sure it's a question of proximity. Maybe it's a question of bad negotiations. Maybe West Racing give too much too quickly and simply doesn't have much in the tank now to negotiate. All those concessions were made very early on, and there was definitely a case pre this government that junior doctors especially were being underpaid. I think that has been largely corrected now, and we are kind of entering an area. I mean, the whole RPI metric is quite funny to me, because I doubt any single profession in the UK, with maybe the exception of YouTubers, has seen a salary increase since 2008 using RPI. I mean, it's a very funny metric to use. The reality is they've increased massively. Junior doctors are now up to 39k, which is more than the median salary in the UK. And there might be a larger point about the decline of wages in this country, which is indeed a real concern. But as to why doctors alone should have considerably more than anyone else is to me a little baffling. So they're in an impossible situation now, because I think a single day of strike is around £50 million of costs. And so if they're planning to do this until Christmas, if they need to, apparently, it could end up very painful quite quickly, especially because I think one of the key metrics I'll be looking at is waiting lists, which have finally been managed after kind of post-COVID chaos. So not sure how much negotiation they have, how much leeway they have to negotiate, but they got themselves in a very tricky position.
Andrew, Francois there was raising the point that perhaps Wes Streeting negotiated poorly on this, starting off with a big pay deal last year and really doesn't have much room now. Do you think part of the problem was they didn't tie that initial pay offer to any sort of reform, any productivity increase or anything like that?
Well, they definitely should have done that. I mean, that should have been Labour's strongest card coming in, was that because they said that they wanted to boost GDP growth in the economy, and that was their highest priority. Well, the most obvious way that they could have said that they were going to achieve that better than the Tories was by making use of their union connections in the public sector to get an agreement that there would be productivity improvements associated with pay rises. It was the obvious thing to try, and they didn't do it at all. It's just very, very strange. This business with RPI, I mean, what a nonsense that is. RPI was de-designated as an official inflation measure in the UK more than a decade ago. There were methodological changes in the early 2010s, which led to the RPI number going wild because of changes to do with clothing. I'm sure junior doctors buy clothes, but it's just an absolute nonsense. One of the things here, of course, is that people are once again saying that they're going to be banning public sector strikes. The Tories had some stuff about that. I mean, in my view, the public sector is almost the only place you should allow strikes, because in the public sector, the situation is that you have a monopsony purchaser of labour. So it isn't quite the same situation that you would have in other industries, where if you don't like your salary, then you can go off to an alternative firm and you get hired by somebody else. You can't do that very practically, at least for most doctors. So I would have thought that the obvious answer for them, if they think that they're underpaid, is for them to be in favour of a more differentiated health service, where you have different levels of pay that are offered for different kinds of doctors with different health providers. I would have thought that was the answer. I think you might be waiting quite a long time before you find there are too many doctors in favour of that, though. They're quite comfortable with the current situation, I think. We're heading quite rapidly towards a fiscal crisis in the UK, and adding a lot of extra public sector pay rises on top of the ones that we've already got are only going to make that happen quicker.
Francois, a bleak analysis from Andrew there. Do you see any way through? I've seen some people suggest that there might be the possibility of trying to get the doctors to negotiate on like their pension contributions. They have quite generous pensions that provide them with money later on. They don't have so much revenue in their pay packets earlier in their careers. Perhaps that might be a way to sort of square the circle. But do you see that or any other prospects of coming to some sort of sensible arrangement on this, or are we just slipping towards crisis, as Andrew puts it?
Yes, there's probably some arrangement to be done around that. There's probably some arrangements around kind of non-pay issues, but clearly the main kind of central issue here is pay, and that's why the negotiations have ended earlier last week. I'm curious to see how they do it. They might play around with pensions. That might be one way to do it. There might be some flexibility given. There might be some kind of quality of life. I mean, there's a huge issue of turnover. For NHS used to have kind of pretty decent stability. Now people are leaving a lot earlier, so there's probably a lot to be done on retention and so on. But I think ultimately the symbol will be pay, and I don't see how they can avoid some kind of pay increase. I mean, it's a little embarrassing seeing the minister essentially begging people not to go on strike in the press, because clearly they've run out of leverage. And, again, I'm going to talk about all the waiting lists which had ballooned during COVID and have become a symbol of the NHS woes. I think they'll cave in at some point. Probably not to the whole extent. We're talking about 1.1 billion, but I simply cannot see the government kind of letting on the strike going on for months and months.
If they cave to them, though, how will they not cave to other public sector workers?
Well, we'll have to wait and see how it plays out with the nurses, I think, the next in line to call themselves out on strike. But finally today, let's turn from public services to the taxes that pay from them. 2/3 of Britain's back offering wealthy investors tax incentives to keep them in the UK, according to a new report, as calls grow for the government to design a scheme that would spur domestic growth. A paper from Onward and the Adam Smith Institute reveals that 67% of the public supports initiatives like 15-year tax exemptions for investors in key sectors such as life sciences and the creative industries. Yet these proposals stand in stark contrast to the pressure from Labour's left, pushing for higher taxes on the wealthy, measures many fear are already driving investors abroad. Andrew, there's a lot of talk about this. How worried should we be about the so-called wealth drain, wealthy people, wealthy high taxpayers leaving the UK?
I think that's just one of a series of issues which is likely to mean that the current projections for levels of tax are not going to be achievable, let alone further rises. So we are going to have, over the next few years, about 37.5% of GDP as our national taxes. If you go back historically, that's higher than it's ever been since the 1940s. In fact, since the early 1950s, we almost never, there was one year where we got above 35, 1969, 70, but almost all the time we didn't go above 33.5%. So we're already way above. And very often we just have like 1 year where we'd be fractionally above 33.5%. So we're way above anything which the UK economy has sustained for 80 years. And if we were to, we still run a 5% of GDP deficit, and people are saying, oh, well, we're just going to have to close that by raising taxes further. So what? We're going to, and then maybe the spending's going to go up a little bit further, extra pay deals on extra defence and who knows what. So maybe we get to 43.5% of GDP taxes versus 33.5% historically. I mean, these are not numbers that the UK economy is going to be able to deliver. You cannot close a deficit of this sort of scale by raising taxes. It doesn't work, even if it were a good idea. In the end, the only ways forward are going to be to grow out of it, to inflate out of it, or to have some sort of spending cuts, which will be ultimately imposed from abroad because Labour MPs aren't going to agree. So the situation with wealth flight is just one version of a whole series of problems which are being created by levels of taxes which the Tories originally scheduled, and Reeves has made even worse, which are far higher than those that the UK economy has ever shown any ability to produce.
Francois, Andrew sets out the whole range of the problems there, and one of the solutions that's being put forward by people on the Labour left, like Lord Kinnock, but also recently this week by Thomas Piketty and other economists of the left, is a wealth tax in the UK. The idea is that you're going to have a sort of special tax on the wealth of the very wealthiest in the UK, and that somehow is going to close the gap. And surprisingly, Labour, even though some of them sort of on the side say, well, we know this is a daft idea, they don't seem to want to come out and publicly talk against it, perhaps because there's a lot of people on their own side who think it's quite a good idea. Do you think, Francois, there's a danger of a wealth tax coming in, and what would be the consequences if it did?
There are three things that are inevitable in life: death, taxes, and Thomas Piketty calling for wealth tax. So I'm not surprised that he's using the opportunity to get this one out. The whole situation around non-dom is interesting. You're looking at countries like Italy, who since 2017 have introduced their own scheme, which has been massively popular. Now, I suspect the weather of Tuscany might help a little bit as well, but it's been a very popular scheme nonetheless. We're talking about potentially 16,000 millionaires lost in the UK. There's another survey that showed 2/3 of non-doms were thinking about moving. So the stakes are massive. There's another study that showed that if 1/3 of non-doms decide to move out, essentially any gains made by Starmer's measure would be wiped out. So the stakes are massive, and you could have a pretty good example of a so-called Laffer curve playing here. I do think the situation is still in flux, though. The most damaging parts of the changes introduced by Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have been on inheritance. And my understanding is Rachel Reeves is now indicating she's ready to temper it a little bit. A lot of these non-doms have a foot in, a foot out, and if the right signals are sent, you might be able to mitigate the damage. So, I'm going to be a little discordant here. I don't think it's fully done, but I do think that the larger assessment of Andrew is, we won't solve the kind of economic situation of the United Kingdom simply by taxing the rich. One interesting thing here, the fiscal burden in this country has never been this high, as Andrew pointed out, but the interesting part is that the median taxpayer is paying less than he did 10 years ago, for example. So essentially that effort has been very much concentrated on the highest earners. So clearly it's not the solution in the long term, and what you don't want to see is not just your non-doms, but also the kind of, upper middle class, high achieving people deciding, why am I paying for the whole thing, and deciding to go to Dubai or to Australia.
Andrew, I saw you reacting very strongly there when I was talking about wealth taxes. I assume you have strong views on the subject.
Well, they're morally indefensible, and they don't work, and they're impractical. Reynolds, to be fair to Labour, Reynolds actually said that they weren't going to introduce a wealth tax. His view was that because it was impractical, he was focused on the point that if you've got lots of wealth which is held in forms like art or your own business or things like that, then it's very hard to assess. It's and it becomes very, very subjective how much tax people pay, because you have to have some kind of expert assessor decide how much your stuff is worth, even though it's not actually sold. It's improper as a role for the state. States exist. The three traditional foundations of a state are family, property, and contract. It would be so taxing property, taxing wealth, is a bit like saying, I'm going to give people a special tax for getting married, or something like that. So it's just a nonsense, and it's these things, they don't work internationally. A number of countries had wealth taxes if you went back 20, 30 years. Most of them have abandoned them. They raise very little money. The ways that Piketty's argument about doing this is based on very flawed very confused data as well. From the United States, the whole thing is a nonsense. I don't actually believe that Labour's daft enough to do that, except maybe as their last resort. I suspect Reeves wouldn't do that. If Reeves got replaced, which he might be, then whoever comes in instead of her might well do it. I doubt Reeves will do it herself.
Francois, what do you think about these measures that are being proposed to actually, instead of worrying so much about the flight of wealthy people leaving, but to sort of set up a new thing in place now that we've got rid of non-dom regime, to encourage wealthier people to come here and to bring their investment and, to do some of the growth encouraging things that the economy really needs to cope with its fiscal situation? Do you think that's a good idea? And is it something that would be politically possible for Labour?
Yeah, I mean, there's a study that came from Onward this week from Maxwell Marlowe, which was really interesting and kind of surprised me. It fleshed out essentially a kind of post non-dom status to get the wealthy back in the UK. It's a complex scheme, but what surprised me is you got 67% of the public supporting 15-year tax exemptions for investors in key sectors such as creative industries or life sciences. Possibly, I mean, we are looking kind of futuristic politics here, because none of it is coming from the left. And I used to work at Onwards, a great institution, but I don't think they're the ones who will be shaping that kind of policy debate in the next 4 years. But nonetheless, it's interesting. And I go back to Italy. They've been very successful. They had thousands of people every year coming into Italy, investing and so on. They pay a fixed 200k a year, and they get plenty of investments. I mean, it could be the future in the years to come. And I think we're going back to what Andrew said. We need growth. And as much as I understand the points coming from the left about inequality and so on, we need those investors coming in, bringing their money to the UK, investing in the UK, because that's the way we'll come out of that situation.
Well, as we continue to brace ourselves ahead of the autumn budget, it's good to hear these optimistic ideas, and we can hope that some of the more sensible people on the Labour side are listening. Andrew Lilico and Francois Valentin, thank you both. Make sure you're subscribed to our daily email briefings. Go to capex.co, that's capx.co. I'm Mark Sidwell. Goodbye.